doing a series on positive thinking. Actually, we're calling it Beyond Positive Thinking that we started last week. And the reason I decided to get into this subject is because over the years we've conducted a lot of surveys in the Unity movement, both worldwide and here at Unity of Auburn. And one of the things that people say that they value the most about Unity is our positive message. We offer a positive alternative to the message that we get so often from traditional religion. You probably know what I'm talking about if you have a background in any of that. The message of traditional religion is that humankind is corrupt, we're sinful, we're lost, we're not much good for anything. The traditional message is that God is this jealous, wrathful being who's ready to throw his wonderful creations into a place of everlasting torture. And if that God isn't enough to scare you, then they invent this dude called Satan, who's supposed to really put the fear of God into you. You know, they build one on top of another. Well, we beg to differ. We offer a positive alternative. We have a positive vision of humankind and human potential. We're not corrupt. We're not lost. We're learning. And we sometimes make mistakes. That's the way it goes. So it's no wonder that when people encounter our positive message in Unity, it can be a little bit like finding an oasis in the desert. Now, there's only one problem with an oasis. Sometimes it's so pleasant and comfortable there that we don't want to leave and continue the journey. Beyond the oasis, the desert awaits. It too is part of the journey. The whole premise of this series is that positive thinking alone isn't enough. We can't avoid the desert. We can't avoid the stuff that we think of as negative. And this is especially important when it comes to our own self-awareness. We all work hard, right? We all work hard to build a positive self-image. We're into self-esteem, and all of that's healthy provided that it's balanced by reality. Truth is, nobody's perfect. And for those people who think they are perfect, well, we got a word for that. It's called narcissism. The pursuit of gratification from vanity or egotistic admiration of one's own attributes. And everyone has a little bit of a narcissist in them. But it can get out of control. And it can become a personality disorder, which psychologists like to describe like this. The narcissistic personality disorder, that's someone who has an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. And behind this mask of ultra-confidence lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism. That's the definition I found on the Mayo Clinic website. Narcissism escalates to the level of personality disorder. That's what happens. That is not a good thing. If we ignore, if we deny, if we disown, if we repress the things about ourselves that we consider to be negative, or the things that we don't like to see, we run the risk of causing even bigger problems. The psychologist Carl Jung, he came up with the word shadow to describe this phenomenon. The shadow is a collection of different aspects of ourselves that we've cut off, split off, rejected, denied, otherwise refused to look at because it's something we don't want to acknowledge in ourselves. It's negative. We don't like it. And the reason that we disown and reject it goes all the way back to our childhood. Things are pretty much a done deal, they say, by the time you're 7 years old. These shadow objects are often things that cause mommy or daddy to disapprove of us. If I do this, if I say that, mommy or daddy won't love me. My friends won't accept me. So we take that behavior, we take that part of us, and we repress it. We disown it. That's not me. Mommy won't approve. We deny it, we repress it, and it's still there. It becomes unconscious, where it keeps on doing its thing. And it can show up in behavior in ways that we're often not even aware of. Psychologists, they call it the repressed unconscious. A big part of the spiritual work that we do involves making the unconscious conscious again, to bring these things to the surface. They come up to be healed. They are revealed to be healed. But they can't be healed until we're willing to look at it and to own it. We have to learn how to own it, or we will be owned by it without really even realizing that it's happening. It's called shadow work, this process of revealing and healing. And it's been a bit of a tough sell in the Unity movement because we do tend to be obsessively and exclusively focused on the positive. That conduct and behavior that we repress, well, it comes back to us in ways that we really don't often recognize. There's a book that I've used a few years back called Integral Spirituality by Ken Wilber, and he devotes an entire chapter to the shadow. The chapter is called The Shadow and the Disowned Self. And here's what he has to say on this subject. It's astonishing that I can deny I. That I can take part of myself, my I-ness, and push them on the other side of the self-boundary, attempting to deny ownership of those aspects of myself that are perhaps too negative to accept. Yet, pushing them away does not actually get rid of them, but simply converts them into painful neurotic symptoms. Shadows of a disowned self come back to haunt me. I like that last line. Shadows of a disowned self come back to haunt me. It would be a good Halloween talk. But if what he says is actually true, and I'm here to tell you that this is true, we can be prepared to deal with this because we know that it's there if we're willing to look at it and accept it. Once again from Ken Wilber. He says, those things in the world that most disturb and upset me about others are actually my own shadow qualities, which are now perceived as out there. And if it's not something that I've actually done myself, then it's usually something that I can imagine myself doing under the right circumstances. I'm capable of this, but I don't want to admit it. So for example, if someone were to cut me off in traffic, and I were to render the single-digit high sign salute for their performance, it's at that point I might want to ask myself, well, have I ever done anything like that? That it's bugging me so much, what have I done? And of course, if I look carefully at the past, I'll realize that, well, yeah, okay, fine, I did something like that, but it was totally different.
Right.
It was totally different, right? I didn't mean it. It was an accident. It was inadvertent. But this guy, this guy did it on purpose, right? Yeah, right. How do we know that? How do I know that? I don't. But the shadow thinks that it knows. Remember that old radio show called The Shadow? The shadow knows. Not in this situation. The shadow only thinks that it knows. It thinks that it knows what everyone's motivation is. It don't know a thing. It don't know a thing. I want to tell you about a myth that goes around in spiritual circles. The myth says that spiritually advanced people, those who consider themselves to be enlightened, there are some people who actually claim to no longer have any ego. Trust me, I've heard this. No ego, totally enlightened. The myth that goes around is that those folks don't need to do shadow work. It's a myth. The more spiritually advanced you are, the more you need to be looking for the shadow, especially spiritual teachers. There are entire books that have been written about what happens when spiritual teachers decide that they don't have to live by the same rules that they want to apply to everyone else. Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, doesn't matter what faith or what culture they come from. Some of you might remember, those of you who were part of our mindfulness class last fall, was based on the book called Waking Up by Sam Harris. He has a whole chapter in the book devoted to gurus with feet of clay. Gurus who come crashing down to earth because of ego, lack of self-awareness, and unwillingness to look at the shadow aspects. Now, for those of us who admire Jesus as a great spiritual teacher, we should all remember that he did his own shadow work. You can find it in the story about how he went out into the wilderness after his baptism. Remember that? The Holy Spirit descends upon him, and when the baptism is over, he goes out into the desert, and he is tempted by the devil. Now, we can interpret this situation, the devil, as being his shadow. And I think that's how the whole idea of Satan or the devil came into being. Human beings, we projected our negative aspects onto a supernatural being that we invented. Hey, wasn't me. It was the devil that made me do it. The devil made me do it. Good old Flip Wilson. We take the disowned shadow, we repress it, we project it, we call it Satan, and then we blame it for the evil in the world. Pretty convenient, eh? The devil is the way they talked about the shadow. They were encountering the shadow. They didn't know it at the time. They didn't understand it yet. So in this story about Jesus, the devil comes and tempts him to do some egotistical things. It tempts him to do things to show the world how great and how powerful he was. It tempted him to do things to gain more admiration, more power, more possessions. And I really find it fascinating that the powers that be left this story in the Gospels, as if to suggest that maybe the outcome would have been different, that maybe he would have succumbed to the temptation. Why even suggest a thing like that? This story draws you in because you want to see what happens. Does he give in? How does he handle it? What does he do? And of course, in the end, Jesus wins. And he does it simply by speaking words of truth. Nothing dramatic. This doesn't turn into some titanic battle between good and evil. This doesn't become Jesus versus Satan in the cage match of the century for the heavyweight title or anything like that. Jesus doesn't resort to violence. He doesn't declare war on it. He doesn't even raise his voice or demonstrate hatred or even hostility. He simply says, I see you. I know what you are. Stop. Leave me. You have no power over me. That's it. That's it. I see you. I know you're there. And I'm not going to go along with what you want. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. Try to kill it. You just end up strengthening it. Approach it with hatred or a violent attitude, and all you do is strengthen the shadow qualities of anger and violence. So it all starts with being willing to look at the situation, engaging the shadow. And if it's something that sneaks up, and this happens, sometimes it sneaks up, we're not aware of it, we act on it before we realize what's happening, well, we can still work with it. We may miss the first opportunity to say no or leave me, but that doesn't mean that we just brush it off and say, oh, well, look what happened, too late. Too late to do anything about it now. Well, that's not true. We're not powerless. Guaranteed there'll be another opportunity. If we miss one, there will probably be another opportunity. And that's when we get to use the same technique that we saw in that story about Jesus. He used a format, I think, that's very familiar to us in Unity, where we talk about denials and affirmations. Very simply, that's what he was doing. A denial is our way of saying no to something that we either know is not true or something that we don't want to have take root in consciousness. People can get the wrong idea about denials. You've probably heard the old expression, denial ain't a river in Egypt. They're referring to people who are trying to deny reality. And anytime we deny reality, we are engaging in metaphysical malpractice. Here's an example from our old friends Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin says to Hobbes, I say, a day without denial is a day you've got to face. And the next frame, Calvin says, from now on, I'm not going to think about anything that's unpleasant. And Hobbes says, isn't that a pretty self-deceiving way to go through life? Calvin is dumbstruck, has no words, and then finally he concludes, I'm not going to think about that. It's perfect. Spot on. That's what I mean by using a denial as a form of metaphysical malpractice. Using denial to avoid dealing with reality, to avoid facing reality. Unhealthy denial means we refuse to recognize or acknowledge the appearance. For example, last weekend, those of you who were here, I mentioned that I had a cold. Well, how do I know that? Well, sore throat, chest and head congestion, headache, sneezing, coughing, runny nose. My ears were so plugged up I could hardly hear, so if it seemed like I was having difficulty communicating, that was part of the problem. There's lots of clues that let you know that there's a cold at work here, and yet there are still some let's say, old school Unity folks who say that what I just did, acknowledging the fact that I had a cold, admitting the symptoms, was wrong, or some kind of error thinking. I should suppress it, not recognize it. They say you should never talk about it, you should never name it, you should never admit to the reality of the symptoms. Folks who haven't heard of germs or viruses yet, they're about maybe 150 years behind the times, but that happens. It's one thing to admit that the symptoms exist. It's another to say that I'm powerless. Two vastly different things. And there's a great example they give in a Unity book I've mentioned before called The Quest. And it's in the chapter that deals with, of course, denials and affirmations. The example is a chain smoker trying to quit smoking. Those of you who have tried to do it or have successfully done it, quitting smoking is very, very difficult. It can be a major challenge. So the chain smoker is trying to quit. Now, you don't go about it by saying, I don't smoke. You don't do it by saying, I don't have any cravings for a cigarette. It's not how it works. You start by acknowledging the appearance. It feels as if I need a cigarette. That's the appearance. The craving is there. It feels as if I need a cigarette. And then we follow it up with the denial. It feels as if I need a cigarette, but that's not true. I don't need cigarettes. The craving is there. I don't need them. Then we add the affirmation. I have the power within me and around me to release them. I have willpower, I have intention, I have mental and physical strength, plus there are other resources outside, maybe a patch, maybe some gum, maybe some hypnosis to help with that. So denial is the power of no. Doesn't mean we negate or deny reality. It's our power to speak words, to speak the word no in consciousness. And another good example here is from the book Dynamics for Living by our co-founder Charles Fillmore. He tells us that thought is controlled by the right use of affirmation and denial, by the power of the mind to accept and reject. The power of the mind is the I am. The power of the mind is the I am. We sang that song earlier today, I am, I am, I am. That's the power of the mind, the I am. And it is through the avenue of I am expression and thought control that thought control, dominion, and mastery are obtained. Thoughts are controlled by the mind through its power to say yes or no. So our positive message, again, is more than just positive thinking, far more than just positive thinking. We have to be able to deal with the negative. We have to be able to look at the shadow side of reality, learn how to say no without disowning and repressing it, and then affirm the truth. That in some way we can speak words that say, I'm not powerless. This exists. It may be temporary. I'm not powerless, whatever it takes. The positive message that we have that goes beyond positive thinking is that there are tools and techniques that we can learn to better equip ourselves to deal with the negative experiences that life ultimately brings. And after we get back from Lake Tahoe next week, we're going to continue to explore more of those tools and more of those techniques, so you got a few more things to put into your spiritual toolbox. So I hope you'll join us, and see you then. Thank you.